I said, those conclusions didn't set well with his superiors, but he still wrote them out, handwritten, not published during his lifetime, a manuscript entitled The Coming of the Messiah in Glory and Majesty, writing under a pseudonym, Juan Josephat Ben Ezra. Now, Lacunza himself tells us why he wrote this book, well, this manuscript. And that is because, and now I'm paraphrasing his own words, because he wanted Roman Catholic priests to take their Bibles from off the shelf, blow the dust and the cobwebs from off of them, and then study to see whether or not his views were correct. In other words, he's trying to get discussion going on his understanding. And as I say, well, there's a lot we don't agree with Lacunza on, but there are these interesting things that he's bringing out. Now, he died in 1801 by the way of natural causes. I thought I should throw that in. And at that point, his book had not yet been printed. But handwritten copies circulated not only in Italy and Spain, but they made their way across the Atlantic Ocean. And there are reports of handwritten copies of either all or part of Lacunza's lengthy manuscript circulating in Mexico, South America, Cuba, as well as I say, in Europe. And copies were translated into Latin, Italian, and French, besides the Spanish. And it did cause a great deal of discussion among the Roman Catholic priesthood. The first edition of Lacunza was printed in Cadiz, Spain, after the Inquisition was thrown out in 1811. There was an edition also printed in Spain, Toulouse, Spain, in 1812, and then subsequent editions in 1816 in London, a Spanish edition. That edition was paid for by Manuel Belgrano, one of the founders of Argentina, so it gives you some idea of what impact Lacunza was having. It was being read in influential circles. If one of the founders, we would say not maybe George Washington, but Thomas Jefferson or somebody, to get an equivalent, one of the founders of Argentina. It caused a real stir. So much of a stir that the Roman Catholic Church decided they better put a stop to the book. And so in 1824, the Congregation of the Index prohibited Lacunza's book from being printed or read, and Pope Leo XII issued the formal decree that you weren't to publish the book in any language. And that was posted in various places. Well, up to then, Lacunza hadn't been translated into English. But guess what? There were some English Protestants who apparently said, I haven't found this directly, but apparently said, and who does the Pope think he is, saying that we can't? We don't have the book in English. Let's put it in English. And sure enough, they printed it in 1826, in 1827, I should say, in English. So here it was, a book written by a most unlikely person, right at the right time, to get people studying Daniel and Revelation. Incredible, if you ask me. Now let's talk about another one. And this fellow's even more colorful. Oh, I didn't show you this, did I? This is the only picture of Lacunza I've found. So this is... And before you ask, no, I have not found an original of that, so there's not an original of that in my collection. But if I ever found one, even if I had to... Oh, well, we better not go there, huh? Mortgage my... No, I wouldn't either. But anyway. Okay, the next fellow. Interesting. Joseph Wolf. Joseph Wolf. What kind of a person do you think that is, nationality, with a name like Joseph? Doesn't sound Oriental to me. Jewish, that's right. I'm talking about some unlikely people that you would not expect if we were going to say, who we're going to get interested in Daniel and Revelation and all that, you wouldn't necessarily think it would be a Jew. But let's make it a little more difficult for God, because, God likes challenges. Now, Joseph Wolf was born in Bavaria, but he was raised in Prussia, born in 1795. His father, David Wolf, was an Orthodox Jewish rabbi. As I say, this is not just a Jew that hardly ever goes to the synagogue. This is the son of an Orthodox Jewish rabbi. As I say, God likes good-sized challenges. At the age of 4, Rabbi Wolf, the father, began to especially educate, indoctrinate, whatever words you want to use, his young son in all the beliefs of being an Orthodox Jew. And so he began to teach and lecture and interact with the young boy. Now, the Wolf family, from the accounts we have, didn't have a cow, so when they needed milk, they would have to go to a neighbor to buy milk. And so by the age of 4, 5, 6, and there when just a young boy, why one of the things that Joseph was supposed to do was to go to the neighbor and to get the milk. And so he went down the street to the neighbor a man by the name of Dr. Spies, who was a Protestant, actually a Lutheran. And he was also, when I say Dr. Spies, he was a surgeon, but he also was a barber. Now, you know, in medieval times, those two occupations went together, barber-surgeon. Apparently they were still in Europe in the early or late 1700s, early 1800s. I don't know why. I haven't studied it. I suppose if you were a barber and shaved him too close, you could stitch him up. What?
No. Then they actually believed that when they cut your hair, you would bleed to death if they didn't.
So they were prepared. Yeah, I did read that somewhere. But it's a lot.
Singe the hair.
But anyway, so he's a barber-surgeon, but he's also got a cow. That's the important part of the story at this point, is he's got a cow. And he's also got access to the son of the Orthodox Jewish rabbi. So while he's there milking the cow, he's asking the young son, a young boy who has to stand there and make certain that no gnats or impurities or anything get into the milk that would defile it. So as Orthodox Jews, they could not use it. So he's standing there doing his job, and Dr. Spies is milking the cow, and he's asking the young boy, how come the Jews, and I remember this is about 1800, how come you Jews are dispersed all over the world and you don't have a homeland? Joseph thinks to himself. He's, 4, 5, 6 years of age. Well, at that age, boys, kids, not just boys, there's somebody that has the answer to everything. Who's that? That's Dad. 16, Dad knows nothing. But at 6, Dad knows a lot. So Joseph goes home. And asks his father, the rabbi, why is it that we're dispersed all over the world? Why don't we have a homeland, we Jews, anymore? And his father, the rabbi, said, well, my son, I need to tell you. God sent prophets to our people, and we ignored or rejected or killed, in some cases, the prophets. And in his displeasure, God has dispersed us all over the world. That made sense to the young boy, so he went back and related to Dr. Spies what his father had told him. Well, another day, more milk and more questions. Why is it that why did the Jews kill Jesus? Dr. Spies wanted to know. Jesus, Joseph thinks to himself. Who's this Jesus that this Christian, this Protestant is talking about? So, of course, who knows the answer? Dad. So he goes home and asks his father, who's this Jesus that the Christians are talking about? And what is this about him being killed? Well, his father, to again summarize the account that Joseph Wolf has given us of the conversation, his father said, well, a couple thousand years ago, there was a Messiah who came, a teacher who came, claimed to be the Messiah. Now, he said many, many good things, but he claimed to be the Son of God, and that's blasphemy. And so, therefore, he deserved to be put to death. But in this young boy's mind, he's beginning to say, Jesus. Father said he said a lot of good things, but he claimed to be the Son of God. I wonder if the Christians are right. But he's not yet convinced. He's just thinking. Well, another day, down the street to get milk, and more questions. Joseph, Dr. Spies asks, Joseph, when you read Isaiah 53, who's the prophet talking about there? Is he talking about himself? Or is he talking about somebody else? Who's he talking about? And Joseph thought to himself, oh, that's interesting. My father, we've covered the Bible, but I don't remember ever him discussing Isaiah 53 with me. That's the forbidden chapter for Jews. I don't remember him ever discussing that. I better go ask him. So he goes home, and he asks his father, Father, can you tell me in Isaiah chapter 53, who's the prophet talking about there? Who's he describing? Is he describing himself, or is he describing someone else? Who's he talking about? And the father got a scowl on his face and said, don't you think your mother needs you in the kitchen right now? And Joseph realized his father didn't want to discuss who the prophet may have been referring to in Isaiah 53. But at the age of 7, Joseph Wolf became convinced that Jesus was who he claimed to be. And he wanted to become a Christian, 7 years of age, just a bright kid. He takes himself down the street to the Lutheran pastor, presents himself for baptism. Now, I don't know how many ministers we have here, but at least 1 or 2 I see. If the son of the Orthodox Jewish rabbi, the 7-year-old son, presented himself at your door asking for baptism, what would you do? Probably the same thing that dear Lutheran pastor said. Son, I think you better go back and think about it a little bit more. I think that would just be better. He refused. Well, that did not stop Joseph from wanting to know more about Jesus. And he was asking so many questions and always trying to talk to people about Jesus so much that his father, the rabbi, got very, very concerned that his young son, not knowing that he'd already been to the Lutheran pastor, might turn Christian. And what would that look like if the son of the local Orthodox Jewish rabbi became a Christian? I better get this kid out of town. So he sent him off to Uncle Asher Wolf. This was age 10. This was David Wolf's brother, Asher Wolf. And so Joseph is sent over to where Asher Wolf lives, and there, to get an education, he was sent to the best school in town, which of course was a Christian school, and he was not required, because he was a Jew, they did not require him to take religion classes. But which classes did he want to take the most? Religion classes. So he went anyway, even though he wasn't required. And he kept asking questions about Jesus. Could not find enough out about Jesus. Just could not. Kept going and going. And finally, guess what? Uncle Asher Wolf gets nervous. And he thinks, what if this kid converts to Christianity? What's my brother, the rabbi, going to think? I've got to get this kid out of here. So he's sent off to another relative, to cousin Moses, I think I have the name here somewhere, Moses Cohen. Well, again, wherever Moses Cohen lived, Joseph is enrolled in a Christian school. And the more questions he asks, he keeps asking him. In fact, he asked more questions about Jesus, apparently, than all the other students in the class combined. He just couldn't find enough about Jesus. And he finally, just so irritated the teacher said, why in the world are you so interested in Jesus? Don't you know he was just a man like the rest of us? But Joseph was undeterred. Joseph decided that he needed a Bible. And he had a little bit of money that his father had given him before starting all these sojourns. So he goes to the bookstore and he finds out that he can buy a New Testament. He does not have enough money to buy a whole Bible, but he doesn't need an Old Testament. He's got that. And he finds he has enough money to buy himself a New Testament. So he buys the New Testament, brings it home, and there is cousin Moses Cohen's wife, and she looks up as he comes bouncing in. You can imagine this kid, 12 years of age or whatever he is, bouncing 12, 13, bouncing in with this book, and she looks up at him and says, what in the world is, what's going on? And he says, oh, and he shows this New Testament. Well, she threw the stove poker at him and called him an infidel and told him to get out of the house. So at 12 or 13 years of age, Joseph Wolf was out on his own. He was turned off to Protestantism because of these Protestant teachers he had, and he starts attending the Catholic schools. Talk about twists and turns. The God's having to put this young boy through to direct him to where he eventually wants him to be. He starts attending Catholic schools. Well, he goes to a monastery, and the rector comes to the door. He knocks on the door, and here the rector comes to the door and sees this young 12, 13-year-old kid there and wants to know what the young man wants. Well, I want to go to school. I want to enroll in school. And I don't suppose the rector probably reacted any differently than any school principal at any Adventist school today. Aha, more tuition, more, yet this is good. But that smile soon turned to a frown, because he asked the young man, and who will be paying your school bill here? And Joseph said, I will, sir. Well, how do you propose to do that? And I'm sure the rector thought, well, get me a broom and I'll start sweeping. But that wasn't Joseph's response. His response was, sir, well, I can teach Hebrew. And the rector looked at this kid, and Joseph said, well, get a Bible, get a Bible. And sure enough, he demonstrated to the astonished rector that he had very good mastery of Hebrew. And not only did the school give him free tuition and boarding, but they even paid him a small stipend. And in 1812, at the age of 17, Joseph Wolf was baptized as a member of the Roman Catholic Church. Now he has one big driving urge in his life, and that is he wants to go to his people, dispersed wherever they were all over the world. Joseph Wolf wants to go to his people and tell them that he has found out who the Messiah is, and that it's Jesus. Now, it's a good thing that Joseph had a great facility for languages. We're told that he was an expert in 6 languages and could converse freely in an additional 8. So that's 14 languages that he could navigate very well through. And he moved from institution to institution in trying to get an education and maintain himself and all. Finally, at the age of 16, someone said to him, if you really want to become a missionary, you need to go to Rome. That's where they train the missionaries from the Roman Catholic Church. You go down to Rome, you get yourself enrolled there, you can learn how to be a missionary, and then you can go to your people. And so word reached Rome, I guess even in anticipation of Joseph's arrival, that here's this talented, energetic young fella who wants to go to his people. And let's be honest. Protestants and Catholics, neither one, have been very successful in converting Jews. And here comes this young man, a Jew. And now what is his passion? He wants to become a missionary. Well, you can imagine when he gets there, one of the first things they do is usher him in to see the Pope. And so he goes in to see Pope Pius VII. And the Pope asked him if he would, while he was having the little interview, would you read something for me from your Bible? I wish the old story told us what it was. I like to think it was from Isaiah 53 that Joseph chose to read. It doesn't tell us. I don't know what. But anyway, he read something or other, and they had a nice little visit. And the Pope wanted to know what Joseph had in mind while he was there. He said he wanted to go to the College of Propaganda to become a missionary. Now, propaganda, of course, is a good word in English. It's one of those that's changed. Goebbels did it during World War II. Before that it had a good meaning, propaganda. Now it has a bad meaning, generally, at least not a positive. Anyway, so the Pope said to him, well, I'm sorry, but the College of Propaganda is closed. I remember this is 1816. Napoleon's troops have been billeted in the building while they were occupying Rome. They're gone now, of course. We're trying to renovate the building and get it back so we can open the school again, but it's just not ready. But the Pope said, I am the patron of the Collegio Romano here, another school. If you will go to the Collegio Romano, I will pay all your bills. I will pay your tuition, your clothes, everything. If you'll go there, and when the College of Propaganda is open, then you can transfer over. Joseph was excited. Remember, he's been supporting himself since he was 12 or 13. And in his exuberance, he reached out, patted the Pope on the shoulder, said, thank you, sir. Thank you very much for your generosity. And the little interview was over. Well, he enrolls in the Collegio Romano. And some things haven't changed. The students began to whisper among themselves. Guess what? No, really? Are you sure? Is that true? And they whispered back and forth. And what were they talking about? They were talking about that when Joseph was in with the Holy Father, he had actually patted him on the shoulder. And somebody finally had the nerve to say to Joseph, is it true? When you were in there, you patted the Pope on the shoulder? Well, yes, Joseph said. Matter of fact, I did. He's a nice man. He's paid all my bills. Why shouldn't I do that? Don't you know? He's like God here on earth. Would you walk up to God in heaven and pat him on the shoulder? How could you? Well, Joseph could not quite figure that one out. Well, anyway, the College of Propaganda reopened, and so Wolf transfers over there. And he's always got his mouth going. Joseph was a great talker, and he always has his mouth going, and usually he's getting himself in trouble as he has his mouth going. He had a friend by the name of Cardinal Lita. Cardinal Lita one time said to him, Wolf, you must learn to hold your tongue or you'll get into trouble. Remember, even a fish can keep out of danger if it keeps its mouth shut. But Joseph Wolf could not keep his mouth shut. One day in 1818, he's there in class, and there's an 80-some-year-old venerable cardinal leading out in this class discussion in the College of Propaganda. And he tells all these future missionaries that the church is training to send out that they had the right, when they were out there as missionaries, they had the right, if they ran into people that would not accept their views, they could burn them as heretics. This little short, I don't know exactly how tall he was, but he's described as short. This little short redhead is on his feet and immediately is asking the professor questions. What about the commandment not to kill? Doesn't this kind of come into play here somewhere in this discussion? Well, the venerable cardinal said, let me put it to you this way. If you have a shepherd, and a shepherd is assigned to take care and to protect a flock of sheep, and a wolf comes along, and, pardon the pun, but a wolf comes along and gets into the flock of sheep, what does the shepherd do? The shepherd kills the wolf to protect the sheep. That's what we're talking. That's the principle involved here, the professor said. Well, Joseph wasn't too impressed. He said, but sir, we're talking about people, not brute animals. And the poor Pope, the poor cardinal could see that he was losing the discussion, and the students were beginning to side with young Joseph. And so he decided he better he better get this discussion stopped in a hurry. And he said, well, then let me put it to you this way. 17 popes have declared that the church has the right to burn heretics. And Joseph was not impressed at all. He said, well, sir, then obviously 17 popes have declared wrong. Maybe you'll understand why a short time later, about 3 a.m., he was escorted out of town by 25 of the Pope's finest. The church hadn't completely given up on him yet. They sent him first to Vienna and then to a monastery in Switzerland, Val Saint, Switzerland. And there he's in this monastery in Switzerland, and he still can't keep this energetic mouth of his and body of his under control. He does some infraction of the rule. He doesn't tell us what. And the rector of the monastery is going to make an object lesson in front of everybody else there, an object lesson from this young man. So he says to young Joseph, in front of all the other assembled people there in the monastery, you are to kneel down in penitence, and you are to kiss my toe. Well, that was not a good thing to say. Because Joseph knelt down all right, but he bit down on that toe as hard as he could and bolted for the door. He knew his days in Catholicism were over, and he bolted for the door. And that was the end of his relationship with Catholicism. So he left the Roman Catholic Church, and he headed to Great Britain. And there he became an Anglican. He still has a passion. He wants to learn how to become a missionary to his people. And so he enrolls in Cambridge University. Now, I should tell you that besides he had a great facility for language, he also had some phobias. And these were going to cause him a bit of trouble to become a missionary. He had a phobia of water. Terrible difficult for him to get on a boat. That water out there, a terrible phobia. And he tells us how when he had to get on a boat, what would he do? He'd just get a book and bury his head in the book and read and read and read and read. Try to forget there was water all around the little boat that he was crossing the English Channel or wherever he was going. He had a phobia of riding horses. How in the world did you travel in those days without riding a horse? He never learned how to sit cross-legged. How in the world are you going to live in the Middle East and not be able to sit in an Arab tent cross-legged? He couldn't fix his own, as he called them, victuals, or his own meals. He never even learned how to shave himself. Always had to pay to have somebody shave himself. But he wants to be a missionary. And so, in 1821, he takes off. And he goes first to Alexandria, Egypt. And I mentioned he got his nose in the book and just kind of forgot that boat had water all around it. From 1821 to 1826, Joseph Wolf traveled all over the Middle East telling the Jews, that every Jew, anyone he could come in contact with, telling them that he had found out who the Messiah was. He said later that he had spoken before pashas and sheiks and shahs and kings and queens and even eventually American presidents. I don't think he learned his methodology from either the College of Propaganda or Cambridge University, his method of evangelism, because what he would do, he liked discussions, and he would put up placards all around town. And he would say things about the Turks, which of course got the Arabs all upset, and about Jesus, that got the Jews all upset. And he tells us that his technique was to see how far you could go before getting yourself killed. That's an interesting method of evangelism, not one that I suppose your conference is sponsoring, but anyway, that's what he would do. He'd get these discussions going to try to provoke people to talk and interact so he could then talk and try on the process not get himself killed. Into Persia one day, to just show you how talented this guy was. He spoke in English at the British Embassy at 10 a.m. At noon, he gave a sermon in Italian. At 1 p.m., he preached a sermon first in German and then in French. And from 3 to 4, he preached another sermon in Arabic. That's quite an evangelistic team right there, isn't it? Well, you don't need a lot of associates if you have a team like that. Anyway, in 1826, Joseph Wolf returned from the Middle East to England. Now, he had been sponsored by some people in England, and he attended that summer of 1826 at the estate of a rich man who was also a member of Parliament, Henry Drummond. He there attended what they called the Albury Park Conference. For 2 or 3 weeks, a number of theologians and others gathered at the home, the Albury Park home of Henry Drummond, his estate. And what do you think they studied during those 2 or 3 weeks? Daniel and Revelation. And Joseph Wolf left that meeting convinced that the great time prophecies of Daniel and Revelation were about to meet their fulfillment, And because they started them a little bit different than William Miller in their understanding, they were convinced that Jesus would come about the year 1847. Now, Joseph Wolf not only has a message that Jesus is the Messiah, but his message has urgency to it. Why? Because he believes Jesus is going to return about the year 1847, just 20 years in the future. And so back to the Middle East this man goes. And he's telling people that Jesus is the Messiah and he's returning. And farther and wider than any other single individual, Joseph Wolf preached the first angel's message of Revelation 14. He distributed Bibles. He was captured. He was sold as a slave more than once. One time he was captured, this whole caravan was going along, and he was captured in this caravan, and they were deciding, the people, the bad people that captured the caravan that Wolf was traveling in, they're starting to talk among themselves. Well, we think at the slave market we can get so much for this one, so much for this one, and so much for this one, and so much for this one. And then they looked at that little short redhead over there. And they're talking in their language, of course, and they know he's, was foreign, probably English or something, they don't know. But they know he doesn't know he doesn't know their language. So they said, well, what do you think we can get for him? And one of them said, we won't get more than 2 pounds, 10 shillings for him. Well, that was an insult. And Wolf couldn't take that, so he started talking to them in their own language. He'd heard everything they were saying. And if it was typical of him, before long he was probably giving them a Bible study. I mean, this guy you could not keep him down everywhere he went. In August of 1837, he came to the United States. He spoke to the state legislatures in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. He preached in Baltimore, Maryland. In December of 1837, by the way, in my collection I have newspapers talking about this. December of 1837, Joseph Wolf preached in Washington, D.C. Former President John Quincy Adams went to hear Joseph Wolf preach. And he was so impressed that he went to the Congress. Now remember, after he was president, he served in the House of Representatives for a number of years. So then Adams goes to the Congress and gets permission for Joseph Wolf to preach to the United States Congress on a Sunday morning. And he preached to all that would come, and almost everybody came. Adams had told him, according to the newspaper, that this was the most clearly reasoned defense in favor of Christianity he'd ever heard in his life. And if you've read anything about John Quincy Adams, you know he was no intellectual slouch. So when he's talking about that, he's been impressed. And I just have to tell you, I got this newspaper. This is the fun part of history for me, why it's so interesting. I got this newspaper, and none of you have ever heard of eBay, but it's I'm sure, but it's a real problem for those of us that collect, because it can keep you easily broke. And so a couple or 3 years ago, I found a letter from Joseph Wolf on eBay, and it was written from Washington, D.C., and it's most interesting. In this letter, he's writing to somebody up in New York City, and it's all handwritten by Wolf, and he's writing to somebody he'd met up in New York City before he came down to Washington, and he says that he's planning on going from here to Georgia, and then he's coming clear out to Ohio, and he's got all this itinerary planned. And then 2 days later, there's a letter from Joseph Wolf. Oh, he also asked this guy, he says, do you know anybody in Geneva? You remember, in those days, you didn't write letters to somebody and just send them to street addresses and all that, because it was all general delivery. So he knew his wife was in Switzerland somewhere, and he thought she was in Geneva. And so he writes to this guy and says, I haven't heard from my wife for a period of time, and Lady Georgiana. I haven't heard from Lady Georgiana for a while, and do you know somebody in Geneva? I need to get a letter over there because I'd like to get some correspondence going. And 2 days later, there's this letter printed in the newspaper of Washington, D.C. I want to thank the citizens of Washington for their hospitality. I have heard from my wife, the Lady Georgiana. I am returning to New York City and will then be going back to Europe. You know what I interpret? Of course, I don't have Lady Georgiana's letter. But my interpretation is, very bluntly, hey boy, you've been traveling around too much, you get yourself home. Now that's how I interpret what she said, in essence. I don't have it, but it's the fun things, because he'd written this letter 2 days before about, he's going down to South Carolina, and he's going out to Ohio, and he's going to do all this stuff. And then this letter in the newspaper says, I've heard from Lady Georgiana, and I'm going home. Now, you ladies, I don't know what you'd say in a letter like that, but that's how I, as a male, interpret it. But I don't have the letter.
He was very sanguine. I have a son that is sanguine, and his wife has to tow him in every once in a while.
Well, he traveled all over. I mean, he'd been gone for months already, 3 months, and who knows how long she had been. But it's kind of the fun things. You wish you had all the pieces. But here you have the newspaper article, and then you get this letter at a several years different time, and you put the two together, and all of a sudden, when I do a tour now of historic Adventist sites in Washington, D.C., I got something fun. I show the newspaper, I show the letter, and I say, and here's what I think was happening. And nobody disagrees with me so far. Anyway, I mentioned that Wolfe believed that Christ would come about 1847. Somebody asked him one time, what if Jesus doesn't come in 1847? What are you going to say? He says, I'm going to say that Joseph Wolfe was wrong. He didn't come in 1847. Didn't bother him. He's coming. He just didn't come in 1847. Wolfe's not going to be bothered by a little thing like that. It's interesting to me to look around the world and see some of these interesting people. Do you realize there was a bishop in Calcutta, India, by the name of Daniel Wilson, who wrote and preached on Daniel in that same period in the 1820s? There was out in Adelaide, Australia, a man by the name of Thomas Playford. There was just a person that I was told about in South America when I was down there last year. There was a fellow in South America, and unfortunately I don't read Spanish. I don't have Wolfe's ability, but there is a biography of this guy that's being published by our publishing house in Argentina, and they've promised to send me a copy when it comes out, and I'll have to get somebody to at least give me the highlights, because what's important and incredible to me is that God, when the first angel's message, it's time for it to be preached, God is impressing people all over the world. As important as it is historically for us to go back to Miller, because that's where we trace historically our leadership, our origins. But when you think about what God is doing, God is getting the world prepared for this great final movement that you and I are part of. As I said earlier, if some of that doesn't send a little tingle up and down your spine, check your Adventism again. Now, here's one that's most exciting to me. Yes, ma'am. You got me in the mud. No, you got to wait. I'm too excited. You wait. Here's the one that's most excited to me, okay? I'll come back to you. I won't forget you. Okay, so here's the one. The Child Preachers of Sweden. Have you heard of them? Yes. And Ellen White describes them briefly in Great Controversy. Here are children as young as 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 years of age, speaking in a language, a vocabulary, way beyond what you would expect from a 6-year-old kid. Some of them preaching with their eyes open, some of them with their eyes closed, some of them too young even to read, but under the influence of the Holy Spirit in a country where the state religion, the state church had said, under no circumstances are we going to be talking about these time prophecies that they're talking about on the continent and in Britain. And just because the head of sub-church says you can't, does that mean the Holy Spirit can't? Of course not. And so what years? 1841, 42, 43, and you find it dying out in 1844. This emphasis on fear God. Here's their message. See if it sounds familiar. Fear God and give glory to Him, for the hour of His judgment is come. Where have you heard that? First angel's message. I mean, come on. You couldn't get much more Adventist than that. They say, what is your authority? And the young people were quoting Joel 2:28. They said the Advent was imminent, but that no one knew the exact day, not even the angels. But they condemned sin and apostasy. They uplifted the standard of righteousness. These young people were reproving drinking and theft and adultery and swearing and backbiting. They were even urging that women take off some of the ornaments that they were wearing. They're to abstain from dancing and other worldly pleasures, and even to stop drinking their intoxicating drinks. And according to one thing I was looking at, 70 distillers in one province in southern Sweden said that they would stop their distilling. Now, you had a question. I had to get through that. I just could not. I was on a roll. Sorry.
You are talking about the first angel's message. Is this us talking, or it's very common among Christians?
No, it's our heritage.
Just ours.
Well, I mean, God was moving on other people, but it didn't catch on elsewhere. That's why the privilege we have of being Seventh-day Adventists, but the responsibility. It's nothing to brag about. It's God's message, not ours.
But the thing is that other Christian denominations.
I don't know that any of them deal with the three angels' messages at all. I don't think they even. I don't think so. All right. So all of this happened. No. Wolfe was on the East Coast. Miller, by 1837, was moving towards the East Coast, but I've never read anything that would indicate they ever met. Though later on, Wolfe and other Millerites would know about the Millerite movement. Actually, that Albury Conference in 1826 in England that I mentioned, that's the beginning of what's known as the British Advent Awakening movement, which was kind of the counterpart of the Millerite movement in North America. It never focuses on a date quite as precisely as Miller does, so it never comes to quite the same intensity over there, but they're talking prophecies. And the point I'm trying to get right now is, what I'm trying to get across is that God is moving worldwide, and we Adventists should realize that we're part of a worldwide movement, as important as Millerism is, which, yeah.
They call it the Great Awakening.
Yeah.
a Methodist and Methodist.
So, yeah. So, let me wrap this one up and let's at least start on Miller, because we'll get some more Miller tomorrow. I'm sorry, I get carried away with some of this stuff. It's just exciting to me, and I sometimes wonder why we Adventists don't get a little more excited about our heritage. Maybe because we don't ever read it. I don't know. I don't know.
Do you have this in a book?
Sister,
It is.
this would imply that I stayed home to write something. And do you realize what you're doing? You have gone from preaching to meddling, because sitting right over there by the wall is a representative from the Review and Herald Publishing Association who's been on my case to write a book. So you have gone from preaching to meddling. I'm just kidding. But Doug Sales and the people at the Review and the Pacific Press both have said, when are you going to put some of this into a book? Well, I don't know. Anyway, all right, so now this is the world. Let's now focus on William Miller, okay? And give me 5 seconds or 10 seconds here to switch notes so I don't get too far off base in what I tell you.
See, you've already got it in.
There it is. That's what you're going to hear in the next hour and a half. It's right there. Doug, are you ready? Okay, so we're going to start now with William Miller, and we'll continue with William Miller tomorrow and the beginning of the Sabbath tomorrow. William Miller was born February 15, 1782 in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. He was the oldest of 16 children. His father was a veteran of the American Revolution, so he was a patriot. His mother, Paulina Phelps, was a daughter of a Baptist minister. Now, from what we know about the parents, William Miller, Captain William Miller from the American Revolution, his name was also William Miller. Captain William Miller was not religious, had no interest in religion whatsoever. He was not anti, that wasn't in his thing, that wasn't his thing. But, so from the father, our William Miller, which we're going to call Bill at this point, Bill learns the kinds of things you would expect from a patriot: duty, honor, love of country, those kinds of things. But from Paulina, the mother, he learns love of God and the value of prayer and spiritual values. Those kinds of things he learns from his mother. Now, when the family is 4, so long before most of those siblings were born, when Miller is 4 in 1786, they moved from Pittsfield, Massachusetts, up to Lowhampton, New York. Now, Lowhampton, New York doesn't even exist today on any map. It's a little community of 150, 200 years ago. We Adventists keep talking about Lowhampton. If we would quit talking about Lowhampton, nobody else would ever talk about Lowhampton anymore, because it does not exist. It's not on any map you're going to find, any contemporary map. If you're trying to look for the William Miller farm, which the church owns, and you go to Hampton, you're going to be several miles from where Lowhampton was. So people make that mistake. But anyway, so he went to a little community, the family moved to a little community called Lowhampton. We're told in the biography, the best biography of William Miller that's been printed, it was written in 1854 by Sylvester Bliss, and you can get facsimiles of it. We're told that the family had 3 books: a Bible, a Psalter, and a prayer book. A Psalter is our hymn book, and a prayer book. Miller, as a young boy, a bright young man, devoured these 3 books. And that was not sufficient for him. Now, he, of course, being the oldest of these 16 children, he was expected to work on the farm, as you might imagine. That was a good way to get easy, quick, cheap farm hands, was to have big families. So anyway, he does that, but when he's not studying, not working, I should say, he's studying. And like Abraham Lincoln would do many years later, and you all have heard stories about Lincoln, at night after the family's gone to bed, he would burn pine knots, and he would read by those pine knots to try to self-educate himself. Because there was, the teachers would come through, but they would hold school for 3 or 4 months, and that was it, because the rest of the time the kids were out working on the farm. So it was only in the middle of the winter that you could have school, and that was not sufficient for William Miller. So he's growing up there in Lowhampton, and he's borrowing books from people, and he's reading like Lincoln would a few years later by the light of pine knots. His father, who's not apparently, he's a patriot, but he's apparently not too worried about education, came down one night, thought the house was afire when he saw this red glow downstairs, sees his son, finds his son there in front of the hearth with the pine knots burning and reading, and at least we're told from then on he was a little more sympathetic to his son. But he never did, I don't think, quite understand his son's yearning for an education. Sometime along about late 1700s, 1798, 1799, somewhere in there, William Miller, Bill Miller, went over to a little place just across the line. Lowhampton, New York is literally about a quarter of a mile inside the New York state line. I mean, when you're going to Miller's house, if you're not looking when you cross into New York State, you've missed the turn. Seriously, it's that close there. So Miller is now over in Poultney, Vermont. And again, just for the technical, East Poultney, Vermont was the Poultney of Miller's time. So you have to go to East Poultney today, but it was known as Poultney then. The town of Poultney has moved a couple of miles to the west. So he's in Poultney, or East Poultney, whichever you want to call it, and he's working over there one summer, and somewhere over there, one of these summers, 1798, 99, somewhere in there, he meets a young girl by the name of Lucy Smith. Now, once he has met Lucy, he can find more excuses to get those 6 or 8 miles from Lowhampton, New York, over to Poultney than you can imagine, until on June 29, 1803, Miss Lucy P. Smith from Poultney, Vermont, became Mrs. Lucy P. Miller. Miller now moves over there, establishes his home, his family in Poultney, and he and Lucy will eventually have 10 children. 2 of them will die young, 8 of them will grow up. Now, Lucy realizes that she has married a farm kid, and she is an astute young lady because she knows that this young farm kid is not living up to his potential yet. And he wants to get a better education. I think when he got to Poultney, he must have thought he'd died and gone to heaven. I know that's not good Adventist theology, but let me explain what I'm saying. Poultney, according to one history book I was looking at, Poultney was the first town in the entire state of Vermont. You know that long, skinny state up there? First town in the entire state to have a free public library. Now, up to now, he had been borrowing books to add to his little limited knowledge in those 3 that they had. He'd borrow them from a lawyer or a doctor or whoever. He doesn't have to borrow books. He can go to the public library. Now, I have no idea what size collection they had. It may have been 2 shelves of books. I don't know. But it was free. And it was a public library. And we're told that Lucy, realizing that if her husband would read and study, he would become refined. She thought to herself, if he's refined, so we're told, if he's refined, he will make a better husband and father to any children that we may have. So, anytime he wasn't working, she makes it possible for him to go to the library. And he's reading and devouring what he's learning. And he is studying history, having no idea, even in the twists and turns in his life, where God's going to eventually lead him. He reads history, loves history, but he also begins to read some of the philosophical deistic books of that time by authors such as Voltaire and David Hume and Thomas Paine and Ethan Allen. And Miller begins to subscribe to the deism, their philosophy that they had, their idea that God, at some point in the distant past, had created the universe, and sort of like an old-fashioned clock that you might wind up and set it ticking. He wound up the universe and set it ticking, and then he took off. And he hasn't checked in yet, or since, to see what's going on. The universe is just running, tick, 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 tick on this great clock that God started. And so they didn't believe in a personal God, or a God that answers prayers, or takes in affairs in the interest of nations. And Miller subscribes to this. He becomes a skeptic. He joined the local deist debating society in Poultney, or today East Poultney. In fact, if you go to East Poultney today, the Historical Society building is right there on the town green, and right next to it is a building that they own, the Union Academy building. You can go to the 2nd floor of the Union Academy building, and if you have some imagination, you can picture the deist society. That's where they met. And they would hold their meetings up there on the 2nd floor of that building. And they would love it if they could just get Miller to begin to mimic the piety of his Baptist grandfather. He had a Baptist uncle as a minister. If he could just get them to mimic the piety, they would laugh and laugh and laugh, and Miller himself would laugh as he was mimicking the piety of these sincere Baptist relatives of his, having no idea that all of this scorn and ridicule that he's heaping in absentia on his God-fearing Baptist minister uncles and grandfather is going to come back to him many, many times over. Obviously, his wife is concerned about this turn in her husband's life. His mother is also concerned, very concerned, because she is a God-fearing Christian, and she didn't raise him to have these kind of views. Now, he is there in Poultney, and he's doing well for himself. He becomes the Justice of the Peace comes a little later. Becomes a deputy sheriff. He takes the 1810 federal census. He's a tax collector. Must have been a good tax collector. I know that sounds like an oxymoron, but we'll come back to that in a minute. We are told that he had 2 horses. When I'm talking to kids about William Miller, I say, you know what that means? That means this young man's doing okay. He's got 2 cars in his garage. He had 2 horses that he could get around with. Things are going pretty well for him. 1810, as I mentioned, the census. He was the census taker. 1810, federal census taker for Poultney. He also got an interesting nickname. He became known as Scribbler General. Now, why in the world did Bill Miller come to be known as Scribbler General? Well, you see, here's the story behind that title. There were other young men who were not yet married there in Poultney. And they would be there in town, and they would see some fair maiden who they wanted to impress. But they didn't know how to write, and they didn't know how to speak, because they were not very well educated. And Miller, who had read so much, he could write well. So they would come to William Miller, and they would describe all the wonderful, lovely attributes of this young lady they've met there in town that they want to impress and hopefully get a date with. And Miller then would write out in flowery language all this in a lovely love note that this guy then could take and give to this girl, so she would be impressed with all how he felt about how this young man felt, all based, of course, on the description now that Miller has written. And so he got the nickname Scribbler General for having written so many love letters to girls there for these poor guys, these country bumpkins that couldn't do it themselves. Anyway, in 1812, as you know from your study of American history, this country got into a little scrap with Britain, sometimes known as the Second War of Independence, War of 1812, etc. And guess what? The president issued a call for men to come defend the honor of their country. Now, if you're the son of a patriot and you get a call like that, you read about it, hear about it, what do? You volunteer. And I mentioned a few minutes ago that Miller must have been a good tax collector, and why do I say that? 47 men in Poultney volunteered, signed the list, the muster roll, to go and defend the honor of the United States from their little village on one condition, that William Miller be appointed their officer. Now, let me just put it to you in another way that all of you can understand. If you were called to go today to defend the honor of the United States, how many of you would go on one condition, that your IRS agent was appointed your officer? All right, so I'm saying he must have been a good, fair, equitable tax collector. And they go off to war. William Miller is not in very many battles, I should say, in the War of 1812. He almost dies from sickness that goes through. His father and his sister do die while he's off at war. But William Miller himself is not in any battles except for one. And we'll tell about this and then we'll close. He is in the Battle of Plattsburgh. Somewhere here I got some, this is what you get. I led a New England tour last week, and we were at the Miller farm, and I gave this talk, and I didn't put all my notes back in order afterwards. And I was busy this morning, and I didn't get them all in order, and I hope I have what I want to read to you. Anyway, he's up at Plattsburgh, and he writes to his wife a letter from Plattsburgh where he's in the Army. Well, I don't know what I did with it. I guess I'll just have to describe it to you. Anyway, Battle of Plattsburgh, I should say, if you remember your geography of that part of the United States, there is a long lake that comes from New York clear down to Whitehall, New York, and it's called Lake Champlain. It is actually the border between between New York and Vermont State. And almost up to the Canadian border is Plattsburgh on the west side of Lake Champlain. And that's where Miller finds himself stationed up there. And he writes this letter to his wife, which I really wish I could find right quick like. And anyway, he tells her that he's been looking for letters from her, and she'd promised to write to him, and there's none. And so he says to his children, you know, your mother must be dead, so I'm just writing to you because I can't get any letters from her. So I hope that this letter reaches you, and on he goes. And I mean, you get kind of the sense of his humor that when he's up there. But that's not the important thing, except to show his humor. In the Battle of Plattsburgh, which when you took American history is like when I took it. We studied the Revolutionary War. We said there was a War of 1812, and we studied then the Civil War, but we certainly didn't study much about the War of 1812. But the War of 1812, in that war, the crucial, according to some historians, or one of the crucials, according to other battles, according to other historians, was the Battle of Plattsburgh. What was happening was the British government had just defeated Napoleon, and just in the process in Europe, and they were sending their crack troops over, and they were hoping to send some down from Canada this way. And you know, in 1814, we had a little bonfire in Washington. You've heard about it. Burned the Capitol and burned the White House, and we got a national anthem out of Fort McHenry and Baltimore Harbor, etc. So they're trying to come this way, and their intention eventually was to send a force up this way. That's where Andy Jackson and New Orleans and all that was. But of course, you know, that important battle was actually fought after the peace treaty had already been signed. But with no CNN, they didn't know it yet, so they fought the battle. Anyway, but the idea was, you see, you're going to pinch all of this and try to divide the country. So Miller is up there in Plattsburgh. The Americans, he's a good deist, good logical, rational thinking deist, knows that in his own thinking, God isn't going to look after us. So he's up there, and they're deciding, what in the world are we up against? They send the scouts out to try to find out what kind of British force are we going to be fighting. Now, they knew on the American side that they had about 5,500. They had 1,500 really trained professional soldiers, and they had about 4,000 just volunteers, guys like Miller that grabbed the musket off the mantle, you know, and went off and tried to learn how to shoot something besides wild turkeys. So they're not really too professional. So we had about 5,500. When the scouts came back, after ascertaining what was in the army that was coming down, as well as they knew that the British Navy had a few little boats there on Lake Champlain that they were sending down. So they knew they had a naval force, they had a land force, and they realized that there was something like 15,000. Now, it doesn't take a rational, logical thinking deist even to know if you have odds of 5,500 against 15,000, who's going to win? The British are going to win. And Miller goes into the battle fully convinced that the British are going to win. And he writes to a friend, and he talks to the friend about how this battle is pending, and they know they're coming, and he expects to die. In the letter, you could tell he's expecting not to live, but he's going to do his duty. He's the son of a patriot. Why not? Well, the battle comes, and down come the ships, little wooden ships from Canada on Lake Champlain, and down come the land forces. Now, Captain McDunn, the American, he's pretty smart. He knows he's outgunned, outsized his ships, everything's outdone. He has no chance unless he can just outfox them. And so, in Plattsburgh, there is a piece of land that juts out like this into the lake. And Plattsburgh is in here. And so then there's this little harbor area. So he brings his smaller American ships with fewer guns, and he puts them right out here at the tip, anchors them right out here at the tip, where the British are going to have to come clear down like this, and before they know exactly where he is with his force, naval force, why, he can start shooting them. And I'm not a naval person. I don't understand exactly how you do it, but they knew there was a way that with your anchors down a certain way, you could fire all your cannons and immediately turn the ship around and fire the other side. And so before long, guess what? The British ships that had not struck their colors to the American Navy, they had all gurgled to the bottom of Lake Champlain. Now, there's a date here that you might want to remember. That's going to be very difficult for you, because this battle lasted all of 2.5 hours on September 11, 1814. So at least the date you should be able to remember. People don't mess with America, I guess, on September 11, because they defeated. Now, the interesting thing is, and two things, and we got 1 minute by my watch. Okay, something happens in the battle. Miller is on land. He's not out there on a ship. He's on land, and a shell comes and explodes, and fragments go every which way. It explodes about 2 feet from Miller. Miller is not even touched. He's not injured. He's certainly not killed. He's not even injured. Now, he's all caught up in battle. He's not thinking about that. So that's one thing. And then, of course, the Americans won. And I, again, reading in a history book, a general history book, read that, according to this author, that the only time in the entire history of the United States when the commanding officer filed his report with the government as to what happened, he begins by giving all credit for the victory to the Almighty. Think about that. Miller's in one battle. He's a deist. He's not killed. America wins. And his commanding officer even gives the credit to the Almighty. And tomorrow we'll talk about what impact that had on Miller, if you're back. That's our prayer. Our Father in heaven, we thank you again for the story of your leading in our heritage. As we think about some of the unusual and unique people that you have used to start our church, we realize that you're in the business of using unusual people, people that you would not normally, or we would not normally expect. Lord, we're those kind of people. We want to be used, and so I pray that you'll use us to finish the work that they began. In Christ's name I ask. Amen.